March 1st, 1945. 1400 hours. A forward command post on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. Captain James Caldwell sat cross-legged on the beach, his hands trembling as he tallied the casualty reports from Easy Company's assault that morning. The paper was spotted with volcanic ash and something darker. He had watched Corporal Anthony Stein charge into that meat grinder 8 separate times over the course of 6 hours. Each time, Caldwell had been certain he would never see the man again. Each time, Stein had returned. Now Corporal Stein would not be returning at all. Caldwell stared at the numbers he had written. 8 trips forward, 8 trips back, 16 total passages through the killing zone. The mathematics of it refused to make sense. No one could have survived even one crossing, he whispered to himself. He had been wrong. What Captain Caldwell didn't know, as he sat there attempting to comprehend what he had witnessed, was that he had just watched a single man rewrite the Marine Corps' understanding of what human beings were capable of under fire. The story he would struggle to write in his after-action report would seem so implausible that verification would be required from multiple witnesses. The Medal of Honor citation would read like fiction, but every word would be true. The mathematics were staggering. 1 man, 8 ammunition resupply runs, 16 crossings of an area where Japanese machine gun fire, mortar rounds and artillery shells fell with such density that Marines later described it as trying to walk through rain without getting wet. The weapon Stein carried, a modified Browning aircraft machine gun he had nicknamed the Stinger, weighed 37 pounds when empty, 48 pounds when fully loaded. Each resupply trip required carrying wounded Marines weighing between 140 and 190 pounds on his shoulders across 300 yards of exposed beach under continuous fire. The total weight Stein transported during his 8 return trips exceeded 1,200 pounds of wounded human beings, not counting the weapon and ammunition he carried forward each time. The scale was unprecedented. In 6 hours of combat, between 08:30 and 14:30 on February 19, 1945, Anthony Stein personally killed approximately 20 Japanese soldiers, at close range provided covering fire that enabled his entire platoon to advance when they had been pinned down, and evacuated 8 wounded Marines to safety. The ratio was impossible. 1 man produced the combat effect of an entire squad, while simultaneously functioning as a medic and ammunition bearer. Standard Marine Corps doctrine suggested that a rifleman might account for 2 to 3 enemy casualties in an entire day's fighting under optimal conditions. Stein had exceeded this by a factor of 7 while performing 3 distinct roles simultaneously. Anthony Michael Stein had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps on September 22, 1942, in Dayton, Ohio. He was 20 years old, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and weighed 162 pounds. Before the war, he had worked as a tool and die maker, a trade that had taught him precision, mechanical aptitude, and the ability to solve practical problems with whatever materials were at hand. These skills would prove more valuable than anyone could have anticipated. Stein had served with the 1st Marine Division's Guadalcanal veterans. He had been trained by men who had learned their trade in the Solomon Islands' brutal jungle fighting, where Marines discovered that Japanese defensive tactics were unlike anything the pre-war manuals had contemplated. The veterans taught him that initiative, aggression, and speed could overcome disadvantages in firepower and position. They taught him that Marines who hesitated died, and Marines who attacked often survived. Stein absorbed these lessons with the focus of a craftsman learning a demanding trade. The weapon Stein carried to Iwo Jima was itself an improvisation that demonstrated his tool and die maker's mentality. During training exercises in Hawaii, he had observed that the Browning A&M-2 machine guns removed from damaged aircraft had a significantly higher rate of fire than the standard M19-1917 A1 machine guns issued to infantry. The aircraft weapons fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, compared to the 450 rounds per minute of the infantry version. This 3-to-1 advantage in firepower intrigued Stein's mechanical mind. Working with an armourer, Stein had removed a Browning ANM-2 from a wrecked fighter aircraft, fabricated a custom stock and bipod assembly, and created a man-portable automatic weapon with triple the sustained fire rate of standard infantry machine guns. The modification was technically unauthorized, but his company commander had taken one look at the weapon's performance during test firing and declared it the best damn machine gun in the Pacific. Stein named it the Stinger. He carried it ashore at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, along with 2,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition distributed among his combat load and several ammunition bearers. What the Marines of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, expected when they approached the landing beaches of Iwo Jima was brutal but comprehensible combat. Intelligence estimates suggested that the island was defended by approximately 13,000 Japanese troops, with significant artillery and fortification assets. The Marines expected casualties. They expected difficult fighting. What they did not expect, could not have anticipated, was that every Japanese gun on the island was zeroed on the landing beaches and linked into a defensive system that transformed the act of coming ashore into something resembling a deliberate execution. The first revelation came at Durido 902 on February 19, 1945, when Easy Company's landing craft ramps dropped and Marines stepped onto the beach. Private First Class Robert Martinez, 19 years old, from El Paso, Texas, was in the third wave. He had been told the preliminary bombardment would soften Japanese defenses. He had been told that naval gunfire and aerial bombing had likely killed or demoralized much of the enemy garrison. He had been told that the landing would be opposed at manageable. "I took 3 steps off the ramp," Martinez later testified, "and the entire world became fire and metal. I had never heard noise like that. I had never seen that many explosions at once. Men were being cut down before they even reached dry sand. The volcanic ash was being churned out by impacts until you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. I realized within 30 seconds that everything we had been told about the preliminary bombardment was wrong. The Japanese were untouched, all of them. Every gun was firing." The Marines had expected scattered resistance from demoralized defenders. They discovered instead a fully intact, carefully prepared defensive system designed to inflict maximum casualties on the beaches where attackers were most vulnerable. The Japanese had spent months tunneling into the volcanic rock, creating positions that were impervious to bombardment. They had registered every square yard of the landing beaches with overlapping fields of fire. They had waited until the maximum number of Marines were ashore before opening fire. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sergeant Paul Henderson, 24 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, a veteran of Saipan, described his reaction. "I thought I had seen the worst fighting in the Pacific at Saipan. I was wrong. This was different. At Saipan you could identify enemy positions and suppress them. Here the fire was coming from everywhere and nowhere. You couldn't see the Japanese. You couldn't suppress them. You could only try to move forward and hope. I saw Marines with 3 years of combat experience freeze on that beach. I saw men who had never hesitated before become unable to move." Easy Company's orders were to advance inland from the beach, seize the base of Mount Suribachi, and cut off the southern portion of the island. To accomplish this, they had to cross 300 yards of exposed volcanic sand, under fire from hidden pillboxes, then assault fortified positions on the slopes beyond. The plan had seemed feasible during the briefing, On the beach, it seemed suicidal. At 0845, Easy Company had been at full strength, 240 Marines. By 0915, 30 minutes after landing, they had sustained 68 casualties and had advanced exactly 25 yards. The mathematics were unsustainable. At this rate, the company would cease to exist before reaching their first objective. This was the situation when Tony Stein made his first crossing. Private First Class William Donnelly, 21 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts, was pinned down 15 yards from the waterline when he first saw Stein. This corporal just stood up in the middle of all that fire. Stood up. Not crouching, not crawling, standing at his full height with that big machine gun on his hip, firing from the standing position. I thought he had lost his mind. I thought he was committing suicide. Then I realized he was drawing fire deliberately, making himself a target so the rest of us could move. Stein's tactical logic was brutally simple. The company was pinned down because Marines who attempted to advance were immediately hit by Japanese fire from multiple directions. Someone needed to suppress those positions long enough for the others to move. The Stinger's high rate of fire made it the only weapon in the company capable of engaging multiple targets quickly enough to achieve suppression. Standing upright made Stein a more effective firing platform and allowed him to identify targets more quickly. It also made him the most obvious target on the beach. The calculation was stark. One life risked to save many. Stein made this calculation 8 times. Corporal David Walsh, 23 years old, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was a squad leader in Easy Company. He watched Stein's first assault on the Japanese positions. Tony just walked forward, firing that Stinger in sustained bursts, one pillbox after another. He'd fire a burst, shift aim, fire another burst. The Japanese couldn't keep their heads up when he was firing. Our boys used that suppression to get up and move forward. We gained 50 yards in 5 minutes because of Tony. 50 yards that had cost us 30 casualties to gain the previous 25 yards. The first pillbox Stein assaulted was 35 yards inland from the waterline, reinforced with logs and volcanic rock, with a firing aperture 18 inches wide. Standard Marine Corps tactics for pillbox assault involved a coordinated team covering fire from riflemen, flanking movement, demolition charges or flamethrowers for the final assault. Stein performed the entire sequence alone. He suppressed the position with machine gun fire, maneuvered to the flank while firing, and then charged the entrance while the defenders were forced to keep their heads down. He went in with Detch's pistol, Walsh testified. You could hear the gunfire from inside the pillbox. Then silence. Then Tony came back out. He'd killed everyone inside, 3 Japanese soldiers. He did this same thing at 5 more pillboxes that morning. 5 alone. The pattern established itself: identify the position pinning down Marines, suppress it with machine gun fire, charge it, clear it, move to the next position. Between 0845 and 0930, Stein personally neutralized 6 fortified positions, each containing between 2 and 4 Japanese soldiers. The body count accumulated: 3, then 6, then 9, then 13, then 17, then 20. 20 enemy soldiers killed by one man in 45 minutes. But the revelation that would transform Stein from an extraordinarily brave Marine into a legend began at 0942, when the Stinger ran dry. Private First Class Martinez witnessed what happened next. Tony realized he was out of ammunition. He looked around, saw a wounded guy, Corporal Stevens, who'd been hit in the leg and couldn't move. Tony just picked Stevens up, threw him over his shoulders, and started running back toward the beach. I'm screaming at him because we're still taking fire. Japanese rounds are hitting all around him, and he's running through it carrying a wounded man like it's nothing, like he's just going for a jog. The distance from Stein's forward position to the beach was approximately 150 yards. The terrain was loose volcanic sand that shifted underfoot with each step. Corporal Stevens weighed 170 pounds. The Stinger weighed 37 pounds empty. Stein covered this distance in approximately 90 seconds while under continuous fire from multiple Japanese positions. Sergeant Henderson watched from cover. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The whole area Tony was crossing was getting hammered with mortar fire. You could see the impacts walking toward him, and he just kept running, carrying Stevens. The Japanese were deliberately targeted him because he was the most obvious target, and he was making himself more obvious by standing upright and running. It should have been impossible. The odds said he should have been dead 10 times over. Stein reached the beach, deposited the wounded Stevens with medical personnel, and immediately began collecting ammunition. Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Riley, 22 years old, from Seattle, Washington, was treating casualties at the beach aid station. This Marine comes running up with a wounded guy on his shoulders, drops him off, and starts loading up with ammunition belts. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. He said, "Going back. They need covering fire." I told him he'd just crossed a kill zone that nobody survives. He said, "Survived it once. I'll survive it again." Then he just ran back toward the fighting. The mathematics of Stein's second crossing were even more improbable than the first. Now the Japanese defenders knew to watch for him. Now they knew his route. Now they had adjusted their fire to intercept him. The odds of survival, already astronomically low, had decreased further. Stein survived anyway. At 09:55 he was back in position with 2,000 rounds of fresh ammunition. He resumed firing. The Stinger roared again, suppressing Japanese positions, enabling Marines to advance. Easy Company gained another 30 yards. What Captain Caldwell was beginning to realize, as he coordinated the company's advance from his position near the waterline, was that Stein had discovered something fundamental about the Iwo Jima battlefield that contradicted every assumption of modern infantry tactics. The doctrine said that fire superiority was achieved by coordinated unit action, multiple weapons engaging multiple targets in synchronized fashion. Stein was demonstrating that overwhelming fire superiority could be achieved by one man with a high rate of fire weapon and the courage to stand in the open. The doctrine said that ammunition resupply required rear area logistics and coordinated carrying party. Stein was demonstrating that ammunition resupply could be accomplished by making repeated individual runs through fire that should be unsurvivable. The doctrine said that casualty evacuation required dedicated medical personnel who stayed out of direct combat. Stein was demonstrating that combat effectiveness actually increased when the most aggressive attacker also evacuated casualties, because it meant wounded men were recovered immediately rather than lying in the open where their cries demoralized others. Every trip back, Stein carried a wounded Marine. Every trip forward, he carried ammunition. The pattern repeated. At 10:23, Private First Class Andrew Wilson, 19 years old, from rural Georgia, was hit in the shoulder by Japanese sniper fire. He was 40 yards inland from the beach, unable to move, bleeding. "I thought I was dead," Wilson later stated. "I couldn't get to cover. Every time I tried to move, I got shot at again. Then I heard this voice yelling, 'Stay down, I'm coming for you.' It was Tony. He ran over, picked me up, and carried me back. I'm from a farming family. I'm used to heavy work. I weigh 185 pounds. Tony carried me like I weighed nothing. Ran with me on his shoulders through fire that was tearing up the ground around us. Didn't even seem winded when he got me to the corpsman." Second trip back. Second wounded Marine evacuated. At 10:35, Stein returned with fresh ammunition. The Stinger resumed firing. Japanese positions that had been suppressing an entire platoon were neutralized by one-man sustained fire. Marines advanced. At 10:57, the Stinger ran dry again. Private First Class Thomas McCarthy, 20 years old, from New York City, had been hit in the chest by shrapnel from a mortar round. He was conscious but unable to walk, lying in a shallow depression that provided minimal cover. Tony came over, looked at my wound, told me I'd be fine, and picked me up. I tried to tell him to leave me, that he couldn't make it carrying a wounded man through that fire. He said, "Watch me." Then he ran. I could hear the rounds snapping past us. I could hear the mortars impacting. I was certain we'd both die. But we didn't. Tony got me to the beach alive. Third trip back. Third wounded Marine evacuated. The revelation was building in the minds of everyone who witnessed these crossings. This wasn't bravery in the conventional sense, where a man performs one heroic act in a moment of crisis and then returns to normal behavior. This was sustained, repeated, deliberate exposure to lethal fire over hours. This was a man who had calculated that he could survive the unsurvivable through speed, timing, and will, and then proved his calculation correct again and again. Hospital Corpsman Riley had now treated 3 Marines that Stein had carried to safety. I asked Tony if he was hit. He said no. I told him his luck couldn't hold. He said it wasn't luck. Said he watched where the fire was coming from, timed his movement between volleys, and ran fast enough that the Japanese couldn't adjust their aim quickly enough. He made it sound like a mathematical problem, like he'd figured out the equation, and the answer was he could survive if he did everything exactly right. The crazy thing was, he was right. At 11:15, Stein returned to the front line. The Stinger resumed its devastating fire. Another Japanese pillbox was suppressed, then assaulted, then cleared. 5 more enemy soldiers killed. The Easy Company advance continued. Sergeant Walsh had now watched Stein's performance for more than 2 hours. You have to understand what it's like to watch something that should be impossible actually happening. We're trained that certain things will get you killed. Standing up under fire gets you killed. Charging pillboxes alone gets you killed. Running through mortar fire gets you killed. Tony was doing all of these things repeatedly, and not only surviving, but accomplishing the mission. It was breaking something in our understanding of how combat works. At 11:48, the Stinger ran dry for a 4th time. Corporal Richard Baker, 22 years old, from Los Angeles, California, had been hit in the leg by machine gun fire. I heard Tony yell, "Ammunition's out!" Then he came over to where I was lying. I weighed 190 pounds. Tony was smaller than me, but he picked me up and ran with me on his shoulders like I was a child. The man was a machine. I don't know how else to describe it. Physically, what he was doing shouldn't have been possible. The weight, the distance, the speed, all while under fire, but he did it anyway. 4th trip back. 4th wounded Marine evacuated. By noon on February 19, 1945, Captain Caldwell had watched Tony Stein make 4 round trips between the beach and the front line. 8 total crossings of the most dangerous 300 yards of terrain in the Pacific Theater. Each time, Caldwell had expected to see Stein cut down by the storm of fire. Each time, Stein had survived. Each time, Stein had either carried ammunition forward or a wounded Marine back. The implications were beginning to crystallize in Caldwell's mind. He was witnessing something unprecedented in Marine Corps history. The Medal of Honor had been awarded for single acts of extraordinary courage: 1 grenade thrown on to save comrades, 1 bunker charged to break a defensive line, 1 wounded man evacuated under fire. Stein was performing Medal of Honor level actions continuously over hours. The scale didn't fit the existing framework for understanding heroism. This wasn't a moment of transcendent bravery. This was sustained, calculated, repeated risk-taking that produced results beyond what an entire squad could normally accomplish. The numbers told the story. By noon, Tony Stein, one corporal with an improvised weapon, had personally killed approximately 15 Japanese soldiers in direct combat, neutralized 8 fortified positions, evacuated 4 wounded Marines who would otherwise have bled to death in the open, enabled his entire platoon to advance from the waterline to positions 200 yards inland, made 8 crossings of terrain where the casualty rate for a single crossing exceeded 40%, and the force multiplication was staggering. One man had generated the combat power of an entire platoon while simultaneously functioning as a medic and logistics train. At 12:23, Stein returned to the front line with his 5th load of ammunition. The pattern continued. Suppressing fire, maneuver, assault. The Stinger roared. Japanese positions fell silent. Private First Class Donnelly, who had been watching Stein's performance all morning, tried to articulate what he was witnessing to another Marine. It's like Tony doesn't believe he can be killed, and because he doesn't believe it, it's actually true. I know that sounds insane, but I've watched him do things that should have gotten him killed 20 times, and he's still alive. It's like he's found some kind of glitch in reality, where if you move fast enough and aggressive enough, the bullets can't touch you. At 12:55, the Stinger ran dry for a 5th time. Lance Corporal Michael O'Brien, 21 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, had been hit in the abdomen by shrapnel. The wound was serious. O'Brien was going into shock. Tony came over, looked at me, said, "Stay with me, brother," and picked me up. I remember thinking this was it. We'd both die on the way back. The Japanese fire was so heavy you could see the sand jumping up from the impacts all around us. But Tony just ran like the devil was chasing him, got me to the corpsman, saved my life. 5th trip back. 5th wounded Marine evacuated. Corpsman Riley had now received 5 casualties from Stein's repeated evacuation runs. He was beginning to comprehend that what he was witnessing was statistically impossible. The odds of surviving one crossing were low, maybe 20–30%. The odds of surviving 8 crossings were effectively 0. The math doesn't work, but Tony was doing it anyway. I started to think maybe he was right. Maybe he had figured out some technique we didn't know about, because otherwise what we were seeing couldn't be happening. At 13:30, Stein returned to combat the 6th load of ammunition. The Stinger resumed its methodical destruction of Japanese positions. Each burst was precise, controlled, effective. The weapon that Stein had improvised from aircraft parts was proving to be the most effective infantry weapon on the beach. The modification that had been technically unauthorized was now clearly the right decision. The tool and die maker from Dayton had built a better machine gun than the entire U.S. military establishment. Sergeant Henderson later reflected on the psychological impact of watching Stein's performance. After a while, the rest of the company started to believe we couldn't lose as long as Tony was fighting. We'd see him stand up and start firing, and we'd think, okay, we can move now. He became this anchor point for the whole unit's morale. As long as Tony was there, as long as the Stinger was firing, we knew we'd make it through. When he ran out of ammunition and went back to the beach, you could feel the change in the whole unit. Everyone would get more cautious, more hesitant. Then he'd come back, and we'd start moving forward again. At 14:05, the Stinger ran dry for a 6th time. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, 19 years old, from Texas, had been hit in the leg by machine gun fire. The round had shattered his femur. He couldn't move without excruciating pain. Tony came over, assessed the situation in about 2 seconds, and picked me up. I'm screaming because my leg is destroyed and every movement is agony. Tony tells me, "Scream all you want, brother, just hold on." Then he runs with me on his shoulders while I'm screaming, gets me to the corpsman. Later, the doctors said another 10 minutes in the open and I would have bled out. Tony saved my life. 6th trip back. 6th wounded Marine evacuated. By now, the Marines at the beach aid station had begun to expect Stein's arrivals. Corpsman Riley and his team would hear the distinctive pattern of the Stinger fall silent in the distance, and they'd know that within 3 minutes Stein would appear running through the fire with another wounded man on his shoulders. It became almost routine, Riley said, which is insane because there was nothing routine about what he was doing. But we'd hear the Stinger stop and we'd prepare to receive casualties. Tony would arrive, drop off the wounded man, give us a quick report on the injury, load that ammunition, and head back out. The whole process took maybe 90 seconds. Then he'd disappear back into the fire. Every time, I thought we'd never see him again. Every time, I was wrong. At 14:35, Stein returned to the front line. 7th load of ammunition. By now, he had been fighting continuously for nearly 6 hours. The physical demands alone should have rendered him combat ineffective. The Stinger weighed 48 pounds fully loaded. Stein had carried this weapon continuously while also carrying wounded Marines who weighed between 140 and 190 pounds. The total weight transported exceeded 1,200 pounds across distances totaling over 1 mile, all in loose volcanic sand, all while under fire. The caloric expenditure was estimated by later analysts to exceed 6,000 calories. The psychological stress of sustained combat exposure was incalculable. Stein kept fighting. At 15:08, the Stinger ran dry for a 7th time. Corporal Stephen Wright, 23 years old, from Pennsylvania, had been hit in the chest by a sniper round. The bullet had punctured his lung. He was having difficulty breathing. Tony appeared next to me like a ghost. I couldn't talk because of the chest wound. He didn't need me to talk. He just assessed the situation, picked me up carefully to avoid making the injury worse, and started running. I remember thinking that if I was going to die, at least I'd die knowing someone tried everything possible to save me. But Tony got me to the corpsman, and they got me to the hospital ship, and I lived. 7th trip back. 7th wounded Marine evacuated. Captain Caldwell had stopped trying to process what he was watching. The analytical part of his mind that tried to understand tactics and assess combat performance had been overloaded. Stein had exceeded every parameter that Caldwell understood about human physical and psychological capacity. I'd stopped counting trips, Caldwell later testified. I'd stopped trying to calculate odds. I was just watching in disbelief. Every time Tony disappeared into the fire, I'd think that was the last time I'd see him. Then he'd come back with another wounded Marine. It was like watching someone perform a magic trick, except the magic trick involved running through machine gun fire. At 15:40, Stein returned to combat for the 8th time. The Stinger resumed firing. Japanese positions that had survived the morning's assault were systematically suppressed and neutralized. The methodical process continued. Identify target, suppress with overwhelming fire, maneuver, assault, clear, repeat. The tool and die maker's precision applied to the problem of combat. At 16:05, the Stinger ran dry for an 8th and final time. Private First Class Harold Brown, 20 years old, from Georgia, had been hit by mortar shrapnel in multiple locations. He was the most seriously wounded of the Marines Stein would evacuate. I was in bad shape, Brown later said. I'd been hit in the shoulder, the side, and the leg. I was losing a lot of blood. I was losing consciousness. I remember Tony's face appearing above me. He said, "You're going home, Brown. Stay with me." Then he picked me up, and I blacked out. I woke up on the hospital ship. They told me Tony had carried me all the way to the beach and didn't leave until the corpsman had me stabilized. That was the last time anyone saw him that day. 8th trip back. 8th Wounded Marine evacuated. It was now approximately 16:30 on February 19th, 1945. Tony Stein had been in continuous combat for nearly 8 hours. He had made 16 total crossings of terrain that had cost Easy Company 83 casualties. He had carried 8 wounded Marines to safety. He had killed approximately 20 Japanese soldiers in close combat. He had personally neutralized multiple fortified positions. He had enabled his entire company to advance when they had been pinned down. What Corpsman Riley witnessed at the beach aid station after Stein delivered the 8th casualty would later become part of the Medal of Honor citation. Tony was completely exhausted. He'd been fighting all day, making those runs, carrying all that weight. Most men would have been finished, but Tony just collected more ammunition, checked his weapon, and prepared to head back up. I told him the fighting was winding down, that he'd done more than enough for one day. He said, "The boys are still up there. Long as they're fighting, I'm fighting." Then he headed back toward the front line. The psychological transformation that Captain Caldwell experienced that day was shared by every Marine who witnessed Stein's actions. The experience shattered fundamental assumptions about human limitations. Before Iwo Jima, Sergeant Henderson later explained, "I believed I understood what bravery was. I'd seen brave men. I'd been in combat. I thought I knew the limits of what people could do." Tony Stein showed me I was wrong. He demonstrated that the limits we think exist are actually flexible, that with enough will, enough purpose, enough technique, you can do things that seem impossible. He changed my understanding of what human beings are capable of. The transformation wasn't about heroism. It was about the fundamental nature of courage and capability. Before Stein, the Marines of Easy Company believed that certain actions were suicidal. After Stein, they understood that those actions were merely extremely dangerous, which was different. Before Stein, they believed that individual action was necessarily limited in impact compared to coordinated unit action. After Stein, they understood that an exceptional individual could, under certain circumstances, produce effects beyond what an entire unit could normally achieve. Private First Class Donnelly struggled to articulate the change. "It's like Tony proved that physics works differently if you're determined enough." I know that sounds stupid, but that's what it felt like. We'd been taught these rules. Don't expose yourself. Don't charge positions alone. Don't make multiple trips through kill zones. Tony broke every rule and survived. More than survived, he accomplished things we couldn't have accomplished following the rules. It made you question everything you'd been taught. The irony that would haunt everyone who knew Tony Stein emerged over the following 10 days. Stein had survived 16 crossings of the most dangerous terrain on Iwo Jima. He had survived close combat with 20 enemy soldiers. He had survived 8 hours of continuous exposure to machine gun fire, mortar fire, and artillery fire. He had performed actions that exceeded the normal parameters of human capability and survival probability. On March 1st, 1945, 10 days after his legendary performance on the beach, Tony Stein was killed by a single sniper's bullet while conducting a much less dramatic operation inland. The shot caught him in the head. Death was instantaneous. The man who had survived the unsurvivable 8 times over died from one bullet in a routine patrol action. The contrast was devastating. Sergeant Walsh, who had watched Stein's extraordinary performance on the 19th of February, was there when Stein was killed. It didn't make sense. How do you survive all that and then die from one shot in a random firefight? How does the universe work that way? But that's what happened. Tony cheated death 16 times on the beach. Death caught up with him later, in the most ordinary way possible. The Medal of Honor recommendation was submitted by Captain Caldwell 2 days after Stein's death. The process of verification was extensive because the actions described seemed implausible. 17 separate witnesses provided sworn testimony confirming every detail. The 8 Marines whose lives Stein had saved by carrying them to the beach all survived the war and provided detailed accounts. Hospital Corpsman Riley's medical record confirmed the timeline of casualties delivered to the aid station. The after-action reports from Easy Company documented the tactical results of Stein's actions. The citation was approved on September 14, 1946. President Harry Truman presented the medal to Stein's mother, Rose, at a White House ceremony on December 19, 1946. The text of the citation read in part, "Corporal Stein, acting on his own initiative, repeatedly made trips back to the beach for ammunition, each time carrying a wounded Marine on his shoulders. On 8 separate occasions, Corporal Stein crossed terrain swept by withering enemy fire to resupply his weapon and evacuate casualties. His aggressive tactics and refusal to yield ground in the face of overwhelming enemy fire enabled his company to advance when pinned down." What the formal citation could not capture was the psychological impact of witnessing Stein's actions. The mathematics of heroism didn't translate well to official language. How do you explain that one man's willingness to repeatedly risk death enabled 200 other men to accomplish their mission? How do you quantify the force multiplication of courage? How do you describe the transformation in understanding that occurs when you watch someone exceed every known parameter of human capability? Rose Stein received the Medal of Honor with quiet dignity. She told the assembled press, "Anthony was a good boy. He always helped people. When he was young, if someone needed help, Anthony would help them. I'm not surprised he helped his fellow Marines. That's who he was." The Stinger, the improvised weapon that had enabled much of Stein's extraordinary effectiveness, was recovered after his death. It was sent to the Marine Corps museums, where it was displayed as an example of American ingenuity and improvisation. The weapon that had been technically unauthorized, that had been created by a tool and die maker working with an armorer, became a symbol of the Marine Corps principle that Marines accomplish the mission with whatever tools are available. The broader context of Iwo Jima amplified the significance of Stein's actions. The battle for the island lasted 36 days. Total American casualties exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. The Japanese garrison of approximately 21,000 defenders was virtually annihilated, with only 216 taken prisoner. The casualty rates were the highest of any battle in Marine Corps history. The island was needed for strategic purposes. It provided airfields from which damaged B-29 bombers returning from missions over Japan could make emergency landings. In the context of these larger numbers, one man's actions might seem insignificant. 8 lives saved, 20 enemy soldiers killed. One company's advance enabled, against 26,000 casualties, and a battle lasting 36 days, what difference did one man make? The Marines who served in Easy Company knew the answer. Lieutenant Robert Dawson, who took command of the company after Captain Caldwell was wounded on February 23rd, later wrote, "Tony Stein's actions on February 19th set the example for everything that followed. He showed us what was possible. He proved that aggression and courage could overcome defensive advantages." Every Marine who served at Iwo Jima after February 19th was fighting in the shadow of what Tony had demonstrated. His influence extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of his actions. The statistics supported this analysis. Easy Company, inspired by Stein's example, sustained casualty rates below the division average while achieving their objectives ahead of schedule. Other companies in the 28th Regiment reported similar effects, When Marines believed that extraordinary actions were possible, extraordinary actions occurred. The force multiplication of courage proved to be real and measurable. In present day, at the Marine Corps Museum in Triangle, Virginia, there is a small display case containing the Stinger. The weapon shows the wear of combat, scratches on the barrel, dents in the improvised stock, volcanic ash still embedded in the metal. Next to the weapon is a photograph of Tony Stein, 23 years old, smiling in his dress uniform. Below the photograph is a plaque with the Medal of Honor citation. Visitors to the museum often stop at this display. Many are veterans, some are relatives of Marines who served at Iwo Jima. Many are simply Americans learning their history. A common question asked by visitors: how did he survive all those trips? The museum guides, many of whom are former Marines themselves, give variations of the same answer: technique, timing, speed, and will. Stein treated survival as a problem to solve rather than a matter of luck. He studied where the fire was coming from, timed his movements, and moved faster than the enemy could adjust. But ultimately, sometimes courage and determination can overcome odds that mathematics say should be impossible. Another common question: why did he keep going back? The guide's answer to this is simpler: because his fellow Marines needed him to. The final irony of Tony Stein's story is contained in Captain Caldwell's initial reaction when he began tallying the casualties and accomplishments of February 19th. What had seemed incomprehensible to Caldwell, sitting on the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima at 1400 hours on March 1st, 1945, was not primarily Stein's extraordinary courage or physical capability. The truly incomprehensible element was the mathematical impossibility of Stein's survival across 16 crossings of terrain where survival seemed impossible. Caldwell had been trying to understand how Stein survived. He should have been contemplating what Stein's actions revealed about human capability when purpose and technique align with courage. The mathematics that seemed staggering, the 8 round trips that seemed impossible, were actually evidence of something more fundamental: that the limits we place on human achievement are often more restrictive than the actual limits of human performance. Tony Stein demonstrated that one person, in the right moment, with the right tools and sufficient determination, can rewrite understanding of what individuals can accomplish. His story is not primarily about heroism, though he was certainly heroic. It is about the revelation that human beings are capable of more than they believe, that courage multiplied by technique can overcome odds that seem insurmountable, and that sometimes the difference between the possible and the impossible is simply the presence of someone willing to attempt what everyone else believes cannot be done. The weight of ammunition that Stein carried forward, the weight of wounded Marines he carried back, the weight of expectations he shattered, the weight of example he set. These weights, measured across 16 crossings of terrain that should have been unsurvivable, defined the difference between what was expected and what was achieved at Iwo Jima on February 19th, 1945. One man, 8 round trips, 16 crossings, 20 enemy soldiers killed, 8 lives saved, an entire company's mission enabled, a paradigm shattered about the limits of human capability under fire. That was the mathematics that Captain James Caldwell struggled to comprehend as he sat on the black volcanic sand, attempting to write an after-action report that would adequately describe what he had witnessed. The numbers were accurate, the testimony was verified, the results were documented. The only thing that remained incomprehensible was how all of it was possible. But it had happened anyway. And in the happening, Tony Stein had proven that sometimes courage and determination can indeed exceed the boundaries of what mathematics and doctrine suggest should be possible. The lesson would outlive the man. The example would endure beyond the battle. The story would be told and retold, each telling carrying the same essential truth, that ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, with sufficient purpose and will, can accomplish things that seem impossible until someone actually does them. Tony Stein did them, and in doing so he changed forever what the Marine Corps understood about individual capability, about courage under fire, about the weight one person can carry, and about the difference one person can make.